Lila is a quietly competent office assistant whose life is stitched together by small certainties. A borrowed scarf, a steady paycheck, the promise of a simple dinner with her husband. When she is publicly humiliated at a corporate meeting by a sharp-tongued manager, the shame fractures something inside her. The scene shifts. A billionaire investor, Omar, Lila's husband, who has kept his wealth and power private to preserve her autonomy, arrives unexpectedly, revealing himself as the company's largest stakeholder. His dramatic decision to fire the abusive manager and her cronies is not a fairy tale rescue, but a catalyst. Lila must reckon with how she wants to exist in the world when the scaffolding of their life changes. The story follows Layla's painful reclamation of dignity, Omar's quiet navigation of love and power, and the small, stubborn acts that transform humiliation into agency. Cinematic, emotionally resonant, and rooted in sensory detail. This is a tale about the cost of mercy, the ethics of power, and the quiet alchemy by which an ordinary woman becomes the author of her own life. Lila had learned, over the years, how to make herself small enough to be unseen and large enough to be useful. In her mid-30s, with a braid that never quite held its place and a laugh that started at her throat and surprised itself into the air, she carried the nervous steadiness of someone who had been taught not to break the china of other people's lives. She knew how to balance the ledger at the end of the month, how to remember birthdays, how to press a hot iron over a shirt until the collar lay as neat as a promise. She knew the names of the weeds that sprouted by the side of their narrow street and which of the stallholders at the market hid the sun-ripe tomatoes behind a sigh of generosity. On paper, Layla's job was 1,000 small tasks, coffee runs, calendar entries, the anxious shepherding of an office that liked to think of itself as an incubator of brilliance. The company, Meridian Analytics, liked to dress its hubris in glass and steel, with a lobby that smelled of lemon and a chandelier whose crystals tinkled like a private joke. It was the kind of place where espresso came with a smirk and casual cruelty wore the embroidered logo of competence. Her manager, Miriam, wore cruelty differently. Miriam's hair was clipped into a geometric haircut that suggested control. Her heels were instruments of enforcement. She had the mouth of someone who believed a sting could be instructive. She believed that humiliation was a kind of pruning. She delighted in measuring people's responses like data points, where other supervisors might have called it constructive criticism. Miriam preferred the exactitude of humiliation's name. The morning of the meeting, the city had woken with a thick, moist heat that made everything hum. The windows of Meridian's top floor were open to a view of the river. The sunlight came in like a film over everything, revealing dust motes like small economies of failure. Lila arrived early, as usual, carrying a thermos and the secret impatience of someone who waited for small mercies. She straightened the pastries in the meeting room, aligned the pens, and checked the projector twice because someone once told her that details were prayers. She had been asked, that week, to present the quarterly client schedule. It was not a role anyone had intended for her. A backup presenter, a practical solution for a schedule that could not be moved. The team had nodded in the way people nod when life needs a volunteer and there is one small person willing to be useful. Lila accepted because it felt like the softest kind of courage. Not to be seen by the whole office, but to be useful in front of those she already resembled, faces smudged with ambition, foreheads wrinkled by the business of being essential. By mid-morning, the meeting room was full. The senior partners arranged themselves like judges. There was a buzz in the air that Lila felt in the soles of her feet, expectation, the instantaneous hunger that comes with watching someone walk a balance beam. She breathed in, told herself she would be quick. If she could finish the slide deck without incident, no one would misplace blame on her. If she could keep her voice steady, The humiliation she had practiced against in sleepless nights might never arrive. Miriam sat at the head of the table, the lines of her face ready and precise. She had a notebook with a leather strap and a pen that clicked like a metronome. When Miriam introduced Layla, the room's attention folded like an awning. Layla stood, and for a perfect second, there was only the sound of her own heartbeat, which she imagined loud enough to bruise the air. Then Miriam smiled. "It will be quick," she said, but the words were an arrow. "Lila will walk us through the minor logistics. We're all very busy, so I expect efficiency." Her tone was light, uselessly sprinkled with the pretense of kindness, but the room leaned in as if confession had been promised. Daniel, a young strategist who had once been kind to Lila in the coffee queue, offered her a nod that tried to anchor her. She nodded back with a small, grateful smile. The presentation began smoothly. Lila had arranged the slides with a practical care, timelines, a color-coded calendar, bullets like little beacons. She spoke in short, clear sentences, the way one gives directions to someone at the wheel. 2 slides in, Miriam's hand rose a flat, predatory gesture that asked for more spectacle. Miriam asked a question about indexing that Lila answered with a cautious sentence. The man beside Miriam, Raj, who wore a tie that could have purchased a small nation, smirked and made a sound like a spoon scraping the bottom of a cup. "Are you sure?" Raj's voice was more syrup than inquiry. "Because this seems basic." The laughter that rippled through the room was the kind that takes in its breath to make room for enough cruelty. Lila felt something under her tongue go dry. "Yes," she said. "These are the dates as confirmed." "But who confirmed them?" Miriam asked, an innocent question dressed in the architecture of accusation. "Do you know how to reach our vendors? Can you call them? Will you manage this, or should we reassign it to someone who understands the big picture?" It was an old script, the tumult of education against class, but it landed as if it had been written just for her. Heads turned. There was a slow, delicious cruelty in their stares. Leela's palms grew damp. Her voice, when it responded, sounded to her like someone else's small animal. "I can," she said. "I've called them. I have all the numbers." Miriam leaned forward, and the smile cut like a knife. "All the numbers," she echoed. "Perhaps someone could explain to us how someone in a support role ends up with such responsibility. Or is this the result of charity?" Lila felt it then, a heat under her ribs that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the slow recollection of every time she had been dismissed. The room's laughter made a wheel of it. Daniel's eyes were glassy, uncertain. She could have melted. She could have apologized so thoroughly that her apology would have been a confession. But something, the memory of a mother who had ironed shirts at dawn, the neighbor's advice to stand straight when you could, made her shoulders even. She looked at Miriam and felt, for the first time in a long while, the quiet of an animal who chooses not to run. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." Miriam pushed a button on her phone, smiled indulgently, and let a recorded voice speak the voice of a vendor, clear and sarcastic, saying that Lila had been wrong about a date. No one in the room looked at the speaker with curiosity. They had already decided the narrative. "You see," Miriam said. "There's our proof." Careless, the humiliation lodged itself in Lila like a thorn. She swallowed, tasted metal. Her vision tunneled, and for a beat the walls of the room slid away, leaving only the sound of her breath. A hand on the back of her chair startled her. Daniel, likely with a pitying reach. "Hey," he said low. "Don't save it," Miriam snapped. "This isn't a community theater. This is business." Lila felt embarrassed and unseen, not by the laughter, but because she had believed, for a foolish second, that competence was a kind of armor. She had been wrong. The door behind Miriam was a sliver of light, and she imagined stepping through it into a street where no one would recognize the ache. It was then The room changed its color. He walked in, like someone who belonged to the space only by accident, and then lived there by right. Omar moved through the doorway with the indifference of weather. He was tall, with shoulder blades that curved like an architect's compass, wearing a coat too soft to be a uniform of intimidation. He had the slow, open hands of someone who had learned the economy of touch, not too much, not too little. His hair was threaded with silver like light through cobweb. His face carried a map of decisions. He looked briefly puzzled as the room watched him, then he smiled. Not the Sotheby's smile Miriam was used to, but a private thing, like someone hearing an inside joke about their own life. Layla had not expected to see him that morning. They had small routines. Omar left before dawn sometimes, traveling for meetings that mattered, staying in hotels with views he would later forget. He had never introduced himself at her office. He moved through a world that wanted to be seen and was seen in flashing headlines, the kind of man the city whispered about in both envy and distrust. Yet here he was, in the ordinary light of the meeting room, as if he had dropped in to collect a book. He removed his coat and, with that gentle sideways grace, stood at the doorway. He did not look at Miriam with the currency of a man who needed to wield authority. If anything, he looked at the room as if it had been a painting he had just noticed. At his presence, a polite ripple of recognition passed through the senior partners. He accepted nods with a courtesy designed to reassure. He walked to the center of the room when Miriam offered a project of proof. A public correction. The way one walks into a weather front, inevitable and altering. Is everything all right? Omar's voice was unremarkable, the most dangerous thing possible in a room full of people used to rattling others like a show of talent. His attention fell on Lila, and for a sliver of a second, she saw something that startled her, an unvarnished tenderness, as if he recognized her humidity and knew how to press the splinter out. Miriam's smile did not falter. "Oh, Mr. Rahman, wonderful timing," she said. Her voice sharpened into accommodation. "We were just discussing schedules." Omar's eyes flicked to the small speaker, to the recorded voice, and then back to Lila. "Lila," he said. Her name in his mouth carried a weight that was not the gall of power. It was the weight of someone who had loved someone into being. Lila's knees made a small, bewildered noise. She had never told the office who he was. They used a million words to describe those who had investments: patron, donor, benefactor. But she had let the currency of his absence do the talking. Their life had been a fabric of quietness, dinners that smelled of cumin, conversations about which book to finish, a shared theft of the moon from their window for the sake of not needing city lights. Omar had insisted once that their love be private, that the things money could buy should not be used to guard Lila from the world. He had wanted her to be free to fail without being bailed out by headlines. She had thought she wanted that freedom. Now, in a room of raised eyebrows, she felt the freedom like a draft. Omar listened. He watched Lila's fingers, how they curled around the edge of the table. He turned to Miriam with the quiet patience of someone who could choose many voices but preferred the one that most reflected his life. "Have you confirmed the vendor?" he asked. Miriam puffed like a peacock forced into humility. "Yes. We have confirmation from 3 vendors that the dates were incorrectly recorded by Ms. Rahman." "Lila," Omar said. "Lila, how do you keep your calendar?" There was a softness in his question that had nothing to do with whether Layla was right or wrong. It had to do with entrance into the act of attention. Layla answered, voice shaking, telling him exactly how she kept dates, how she typed them into a calendar and received confirmations, how she had called and saved numbers in her phone. Omar listened the way someone listens to a melody he knows by heart. He frowned once, small and private, as if trying to align 2 slightly different memories. Then, he turned and, with an economy of motion that made the room brace. He called for their CFO. The tuning in the room changed. "Who owns the majority of shares in Meridian?" Omar asked, and the question was a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples were immediate, polite panic in the way people adjust their collars before a portrait. "Mr. Rahman," the CFO said, like a man reciting a known fact. Omar nodded, mildly amused at the theater of it. "And if I walked into a meeting where a member of my household was openly humiliated, what would you suggest as appropriate action?" Miriam's smile thinned. "Mr. Rahman," she said, voice small, "we are professionals. This is about business." Omar rested a palm on the table. When he spoke next, his voice was the soft brief of a verdict. "Anyone who deliberately humiliates a colleague in the workplace creates a hostile environment," he said. "That behavior is unacceptable." He named names. To hear him speak, to watch his face unfurl into decision, was to watch a man exercising the steadiest muscle in the body of someone who had built his life on choices. He did not shout. He did not posture. He used the bare, surgical fact of power. Miriam's expression shifted from bemused superiority to startled, then to fear. The room slithered. Chairs creaked like small admissions. "I will be appointing a temporary oversight on HR," Omar continued. "We will be reviewing all interactions, and if anyone in this room has behaved in a way that violates our code, they will be disciplined. Up to and including termination." Silence fell like a curtain. Daniel's mouth was open. He looked like someone who had misplaced a sentence. Miriam's throat worked. She looked as if she might try a reparative smile and find it sour. Omar's eyes, when they returned to Layla, were kind. "I am sorry," he said. "This should not have happened." The words felt like both a balm and a blade. Layla's knees stopped shaking, though something inside her trembled with the violence of release. She had expected a rescue to look like a hero with a cape. Instead, it looked like a man who knew how to use his name and the ledger behind him, who recognized a wrong and chose a public correction. But the correction was not a fine feather landing on a dark wound. It was work and messy and inconvenient. 2 days later, after an HR investigation that turned up enough corroborations of Miriam's pattern of dismissiveness and a handful of other behaviors. Whispered comments in the corridor. Mails with edges meant to cut. Miriam was escorted out of Meridian. Several of her closest collaborators were also given termination letters. The office that had once smelled of lemon now hummed with the cautious oxygen of consequence. And for Leela, the consequence arrived like a gust of winter air, shocking and exhilarating and terrible all at once. People brought bouquets that smelled faintly of regret. Colleagues who had offered tepid apologies now sought her at the coffee machine with the trembling hope of those who had been forgiven. Daniel called her one afternoon and said, awkwardly, "I meant well," as if intention could be wielded like a talisman. Omar, more delicate than the headlines that would later then try to compress his decisions into a simple narrative, refused to become the subject. He took her hand at their small kitchen table and told her, in the hush of their apartment, that he would never ask her to change how she chose to live her life. "But I won't watch you be diminished," he said. "Not by strangers, not by colleagues, not by anyone who mistakes noise for wisdom." Despite the apologies, she felt estranged from the place where it had happened. The memory of Miriam's smirk was a stain that would not lift easily. Layla found sympathy a strange currency. It bought her coffee and condolences, but it did not replace the contour of the experience. At night, she would revisit the meeting room in her mind, imagining the shape of her voice as something she might strengthen like a bridge. Omar watched her wrestle with the aftertaste of shame. He did not offer platitudes. He made her lunches. He walked beside her in markets as if protection could be folded into the weight of being present. He asked questions, small, precise ones, about what she wanted next. His love for her was soft but resolute. He had always believed that dignity could be reformed through the quietness of attention, not the spectacle of power. For Leela, the first thaw came in a place she had not expected: the back room at a women's cooperative run in the neighborhood. A friend from the mosque, Asha, had heard and said, simply, "You should teach a class on organization. You would be good." Layla laughed it off at first. Then, she began to imagine an audience without the glare of completeness. She could stand before women who were in favor of being themselves, turned inside out by circumstance, and show them, in small practical ways, how to assemble their days with less of the dreamer. She taught a workshop on calendars and correspondence, on how to make the best shopping lists, how to keep receipts so that a life could be told back in tidy sentences. At first, 3 women came: Asha and 2 others who had come because their daughters insisted. But then word passed through the neighborhood like a soft rumor, and the class filled. Women came with eyes that had been dimmed by too many small slights and left with notebooks filled with little reassurances. Lila taught them to write short emails that would not surrender to meekness. She taught them to enter a room and own it, as if it were made of their own furniture. Her voice changed in those weeks. It did not become louder, it became more precise. When she spoke, hands turned toward her like plants toward rain. She started to see the world not as a set of reactions, but as a set of possibilities. Teaching made the feedback immediate. A woman who wrote a clear letter to a landlord and won a repair, a woman who cataloged her child's vaccinations and no longer had to search in panic. Lila's small expertise built into a scaffolding she could climb. Omar watched from the sidelines, proud and private. He would attend the occasional session, not to lead but to hold a bag and hand out tea. When a woman in a fluted voice asked him, shyly, what it felt like to be married to someone who had become a quiet public exemplar, he smiled and said, "She's always been large enough for me." He refrained from expanding the answer. His role was neither to own nor to shine. There were complications, as life insists on offering. The press heard that the wife of a local magnate had been humiliated and then restored, and they wrote stories that preferred drama to truth. Headlines wanted to turn Lila into a caricature, the humiliated spouse who was then trodden to glory by money. She refused the interviews. She was careful with her privacy because there was a stubborn, tender need to prove that her life belonged to her, not to narratives that would shape her into a lesson. Yet the context of wealth changed people in ways that did not always align with generosity. There were those in the city who assumed her proximity to Omar meant she had inherited his influence. Some philanthropists sought to recruit her as a figurehead, flattering her into commitments that would have arrested her growth. She learned to say no. In a small triumph, she declined an invitation to join the board of a charity whose mission she could not endorse. She chose, instead, to stay with the cooperative whose modest rent and stubborn heart suited her. The moment of greatest test came months later when Miriam, who had resurfaced in an entrepreneur's newsletter as an example of resilience, after an alleged fall from grace, sent Layla a message. It was thin with self-justifying language, an attempt to rewrite the past into a case of miscommunication. Layla sat at their small table, the city humming like a distant engine, and stared at the text. She could have replied with scorn, with the righteous anger that would have pleased those who loved spectacle. Instead, she wrote a simple sentence. "I accepted your explanation in private the day I left. I learned from it. I hope you have learned too." She pressed send and felt, as the message went, the steadying of something that had been raw and tender. Omar read the exchange over her shoulder and kissed her temple, a gesture as ordinary as bread. "You decided the shape of your ending," he said, quietly. "It's not an ending," Leela replied. "It's practice." The city rearranged around them. There were evenings when they walked the river and allowed themselves the small arrogance of being ordinary. The way two people do when they have been tested in a public theater and chosen to be private. Layla's classes expanded. A journalist who admired the way she taught asked for a profile, and she agreed only after stipulating that the piece not include Omar's name. He respected it and wrote about the small economies of dignity. Layla's transformation was not cinematic in the way movies make it. There was no single triumphant speech, no staring down of an entire profession. Instead, the change was granular. She learned to place her voice where it could make change and to make boundaries where others had expected pliancy. When a vendor delayed a delivery, she called not to beg, but to enforce a mutually agreed schedule. When a colleague talked over her, she held her sentence until one of them finished and then asked for the floor. These were small resistances, and they added up like beads on a string until she could wear them like a necklace of quiet insistence. One crisp morning in late autumn, Omar accompanied her to the cooperative's holiday fair. The market that day bustled with women selling knitted scarves and preserved lemons. Lila introduced him to the potter, who had a laugh like a hinge, to the baker who offered them a sample of black pepper cookies. The fair buzzed. People knew who Omar was, but they greeted him as if he were one of the crowd. His presence folded into the human warmth of the event. He sat on a folding chair and watched Layla negotiate the sale of a batch of jam, his face a ledger of approval. At the end of the day, as the market folded itself away into boxes and the lamplight turned the river into a ribbon, Lila found her hands full of small purchases. She looked at Omar and, without prelude, asked, "Do you regret it? Firing them?" He paused, taking his time in a way that suited him. "I don't like decisions that are about spectacle," he said. "I did what I thought was right, but I also trusted you to decide how you would carry it forward." She thought of Miriam's smirk, of the meeting room that had once felt like a place of exposure. She thought of the cooperative, of notebooks filled with women's tiny victories. "I don't want my life to be a reaction," she said. "I want it to be a composition." Omar smiled, and the city sighed around them. "Then compose," he said. Layla did. She kept teaching. She expanded the cooperative into evening classes on financial literacy. She learned to decipher contracts and to coach women who were applying for microloans. She began to consult for a small nonprofit that helped women start home businesses. There were setbacks, a grant application that fell through, a vendor who took advantage of a new secretary. But there was also a rhythm, a music that was hers, stamps on envelopes, names written neatly in lists, the satisfaction of a class that walked out the door with a strengthened spine. Years later, a woman approached Layla at a market stall, tears in her eyes, and said, "You don't remember me, but you helped me write a letter to my landlord. My children have a roof over their heads because of you." Layla felt the color rise to her cheeks, not from pride, but from a tenderness that had become a habit. She had been humiliated in a room full of people who considered themselves indispensable, and she had been watched by a man with the means to change the outcome. But the life she had built after that, thread by patient thread, had been hers. Omar's intervention had been necessary. Her work had been to translate the necessity into durable practice. She had learned to accept help without letting it write her script. On quiet nights, when the city receded into the broader hum of strangers' televisions and distant traffic, Omar would sometimes read her a passage from a book he had loved, and they would talk about the small things that made them human. They never forgot what had happened in the meeting room. They honored it as a wound that taught them the architecture of choice. But the wound had not become the total of their lives. Leela's life was neither tragedy nor triumph. It was, in the true sense, ongoing. She had been humiliated and then given the rare, strange gift of being restored in public. She had discovered that redemption, if it is to be honest, is a work of patience. She had been offered rescue, and she had, with the small stubbornness that had always lived in her ribcage, turned that rescue into a framework for other people's hope. Power, she learned, could be held like a tool rather than a weapon, and dignity, once practiced, could become contagious.